Here's what libertarians fundamentally misunderstand about free markets. Free markets inherently become corrupt because the people who are constituting the market are themselves corrupt. And so that corruption will spill over into the free market. If you have a market with a lot of distributed individuals, what's going to inevitably happen is that those individuals will clump together and coordinate and cooperate to create corporations, tribes, groups, syndicates, cabals, and mafias. Why do they do that? Because that allows them, first of all, they have the freedom to do it because it's a free market. Second of all, because it allows them to get an advantage in the market. Every corporation these days does this. Every corporation tries to game their part of the market to gain some sort of advantage over all the other players in the market. How do they do that? By buying up other companies, coordinating with them, price fixing, and all sorts of other shady stuff that they could do. And in fact, if there was less regulation, it doesn't happen today, but if there was less regulation, a corporation could actually hire their own military, a mercenary group, to take out another corporation. And they would gladly do so. You think that if, for example, Microsoft had the freedom to hire its own militia, that it wouldn't hire one and then go and take out Apple or Google through physical force by just like bombing their headquarters? Of course they would. Of course they would. And the reason they would is because if they didn't, even if they were assuming they were good enough and kind enough and, sweet angels that they would that they would be above such barbarity, well, if they didn't do it, another corporation would. See, out of the thousands of corporations that there's going to be at least a handful that are corrupt enough, that are willing to hire a militia if they're allowed to, and go bomb the headquarters of other corporations. And you know what? That would be a very effective strategy because it's going to work a lot better than building your own company. It's very difficult to build a company like Apple, but you know what's pretty easy? If I have enough money, I could literally just like raise an army of 10,000 people and hire some demolition experts, and we could destroy every campus that Apple has. I mean, easy. So you see, that's the problem with your free market. That has to be stopped. You have to stop groups of people from creating syndicates and mafias which try to abuse everybody else and bully them. And this is the history of mankind. If there's one thing you learn from the history of mankind, is that mankind is a highly social species that creates syndicates in ever larger hierarchies, which then go on to monopolize and to bully everybody else until eventually they dominate the entire field if they're allowed to. And this, by the way, is exactly how government was created in the first place. Where did government come from? You see, here's the whole absurdity of libertarianism, is that libertarianism draws a very sharp dualistic line between the private sector and the public sector, as if these two things are unrelated or inherently different. They aren't. The way that the public sector came about at all in the first place, because it didn't exist at some point. Like 100,000 years ago, it didn't exist. There were no states and governments 100,000 years ago. There were only little villages and tribes. But what happened is, like I said, these villages and tribes, they came together, they unified because it gave them a survival advantage. They kept doing that at higher and higher orders. Mafias, syndicates were built. City-states were built. City-states combined together into nation-states. Nation-states combined together into big treaties and international alliances like NATO and so on. The Axis and Allies powers in World War II, and so forth. So, and then all of this occurred, and then this is how we got the state government. Various levels of state government. It came from the private sector. Initially, it was private. in essence, what happened was that it wasn't called a corporation back then, but some group of marauders came together. They created a syndicate, which is effectively a corporation without the legal paperwork. They created a syndicate. This syndicate was like a corporation, private corporation, and it started taking over more and more land, more and more territory, more and more tribes and people. And then that was a tyranny. That corporation or that syndicate turned into a tyranny, an authoritarian dictatorship. And then through thousands of years of public pleading and protests and revolutions, what happened was that our ancestors fought with these private syndicates to seize power away from them because the power was centralized in an authoritarian pyramid-like structure. All the power went to the king or to the mob boss of that syndicate. Those people were overthrown, and eventually democratic norms started to take hold, and we got the right to vote. And now it was no longer tenable for some one guy at the top to call all the shots for his lifetime. Now he had to actually take into consideration the needs of the citizens and the elites and the legislatures and so forth. This is the history, basically, of Western Europe over the last 2,000 years. Until we got to the point where we got a solid democracy going, which is what most of Europe and America is these days. Pretty solid democracy where we elect leaders, term limits, all this sorts of stuff. So see, what happened was, here's what libertarians don't understand, is that we started with a free market. We started with a true free market, but that was so horrible that over time, the free market was monopolized and dominated by a few ruthless and bloody syndicates, which then turned into dictatorships and monarchies, which later were then revolutionized and smoothened out and kind of mollified because that too was so brutal and evil that didn't work. So we had to take power back from the top of the monopoly and distribute it back down to the people, which made life better for most people, raised their living conditions, made them less oppressed. Now the king couldn't just, willy-nilly execute somebody. He had to ask a court. There has to be a crime. It has to be proven in court, this sorts of stuff.